Helps if I actually get the screen started. Welcome to Cup of Joe with Joe this evening. Uh, I'm Idaho Joe. I'm here from Idaho today, and I'm talking about several issues that have come up. Yeah, be right back. Go share. Thank you, Brandy. Thank you. Appreciate that. And Dolores, again, thank you for being ever present and making sure that the shares get out there. Appreciate it. For those of you who are not aware, we have a website, kerberosnews.com. Go to the website. In addition to that, we have our Patreon site you can go to. Share that as well. Remember, we got Patreon, we got kerberosnews.com. These are how we monetize to be able to make sure that we are able to continue to produce these products, these shows for you. So absolutely go to those websites, sign up, become part of our patrons, become part of our network so that we can make sure that you are current with everything that is going on with Kerberos News and with our variety of hosts, as well as the several discussions that come out of those things. Now, tonight, we got a couple of different things coming up. Share, absolutely. We want to make sure that you get out and share this. So let's go ahead and open up with a big one. This is a big can of worms that has been developing globally, because what we are looking at is Wall Street Journal has published a recent documentary on issues related to pandemic supply chain issues. Okay. Now, this is the system of systems of systems that has been working on making sure that the global population has been fed internationally. Okay. Now, this is internationally because we've globalized the economy, folks. Straight up. We produce food in the United States that gets sold to China, to India. We export it to those countries where we support military efforts. This is U.S. aid that goes to support agriculture, industry, and discovery in other nations around the world. This is how we use our oil. This is how we use our shipping. This is how we have offshored labor to make sure that we are able to continue to buy products cheap here in the United States. The pandemic broke this, folks. It broke it hard. Yeah, so Wall Street Journal comes out and they come up with their talking points here. One is of course the global breakdown. We simply did not have the personnel to manage what they called essential services throughout the pandemic. And these essential services include transportation, being able to get the goods from point A to point B, the way we handled the shipping, the way we handled the shopping, whether or not employees in shops in China, in India, and in Vietnam were actually able to produce the goods that we import into the United States. This is our trade deficit that we talk about all the time. The amount of money that we send to other countries in order to buy things that are resold here in the United States. Now, one of the things they brought up is, and this is a short-term problem, reshoring issues. Okay. There's a problem with reshoring in the United States right now. We do not have the infrastructure. We haven't had the infrastructure for probably about 40 years now. Okay, in 1971, when Nixon was president, he made favored trade partners with the Chinese, which is when we started getting all of that Chinese junk showing up on American supermarket shelves. Okay, that signaled a steady export of labor costs that was cheered on by multinational corporations and U.S. corporations because they were able to make product so much cheaper in these other countries, and they were able to save the consumer in the United States money by making it cheaper in Mexico, in Canada, in China. right? This is one of those things. If we handle this mess and we do it right, okay, we can rebuild the manufacturing that we had prior to that Nixon export, before that favored trade status with China, before the free trade agreements allowed the United States to leverage its massive economy in order to get relatively cheap labor in every other country of the world. Nearly every other country since 1970 outside of the European Union, that's another interesting situation. Outside of the European Union since 1970, every country that we've gone into a trade partner with has actually lost in relationship to, okay, now let's be honest, this is capitalism, and the amount of money that we spent in several of these countries did help in some ways. But in relation to the benefit achieved, the benefit, the relative benefits of being a trade partner with the US has always come out in favor of the United States, because ours was the reserve currency that set the standard for the economy, that set the standard for global trade, that set the standard established by the International Monetary Fund, which became the primary lending agency for nearly every third world country on the globe. Okay. But yes, our big thing is we actually have to get through this next period. Okay. Now, of course, we're not ready for that one yet. Let's go ahead and talk about the pandemic issue. Okay. Pandemic. We are still dealing with this. Okay. The number of people who are, oh, dude, yeah, absolutely. Bethlehem Steel, be able to actually start doing American produced steel. Talk show, the podcaster that I was working with last night, MK. My discussion with him will actually be coming out on the 18th. But this is one of the things that we were talking about. He's a libertarian out of Pennsylvania. We were sitting down, we were talking about U.S. trade. What was lost in the 1970s? The fact that in Pennsylvania, you have steel towns that hosted places like Bethlehem Steel, that just shut down because of a combination of corporate CEOs could outsource the labor cheaper. They could get the materials cheaper. They didn't have to deal with U.S. regulations and requirements, especially 1970s. We were looking at the environmental issues, the environmental impacts of the time. And we were writing environmental policy that basically made it impossible for an awful lot of these industries to continue to exist in a profitable form in relationship to the amount of dumping of these exact same products that were coming out of other countries that did not have to deal with those regulations. Okay, now, I'm not saying that the regulations weren't good, but we've continued to misuse them. Okay, we did not take a gradual approach to regulating the environment back in the 1970s. It was one-stop shop. We went for maximum effect immediately. And when you did that, you ended up overcompensating. Now, this is one of those things where our overcompensation, I won't say forced, because a lot of those CEOs for those major corporations, the people who bought out and sold Bethlehem Steel after it was no longer viable as an industry here in the United States, were very, very happy to see that regulation allowed them the excuse to stop doing business in the United States with U.S.-based unions. Yes. They're looking for an excuse to break the unions, and this was one of the options that came up. They gave the excuse. Environmental regulations are the reason we can no longer continue to operate unions in the United States. We can no longer work with you because the cost of working with the union and the cost of meeting the regulations for the environmental considerations, the environmental impact and externalities of the organizations that we have created, that we want to build, that we want to continue profiteering off of, we can no longer do here in the United States. Bye-bye. That's when we started shipping auto working out of Flint, Michigan to Mexico. It's when we started south of the border, Ecuador. Um, all of these issues continue to develop because this was the policy from the 1970s on. It was all about maximizing profit, maximizing profit. And we slowly saw everything shift from right now, from industries that had long-term plans. And we, at one point, we actually had industries that had long-term plans. They had 5 and 10-year plans in how to maintain and continue to stay sustainable and relevant for longer than 10 years. Okay, 20 years even. These days, we're in a 90-day planning cycle. 90 days. If an industry, if a corporation, if a company cannot show a profit in 90 days, it loses its investors. It loses its value on the stock market. It loses its value on the New York Stock Exchange. So anybody who's gone into an initial public offering and is currently being traded on the New York Stock Exchange, there's not a one of them that actually has a sustainable business plan because they absolutely need to show profit in the next 90 days, regardless of the cost. This is one of those things that was hurt by the pandemic. You currently see reduced labor costs associated with it, while we continue to see greater profits because right now they're using scarcity to justify higher costs on the sale end. And one of the other things that we have is the issue right now. We are talking approximately 8.5% inflation right now. Okay, now that's what we're seeing at our end. Oh yeah, I'm describing neoliberalism. 100% I'm describing neoliberalism. And it's really is the idea that we sold our souls to the profiteers because the profiteers promised us something. And they've been continuing to promise us that on the 90-day cycle in order to continue to maintain their profits, continue to maintain our interests. 3 years to show a profit if you don't want your small business to be reclassified as a hobby. Small businesses, you got to show a profit in 3 years. And by profit, that means your small business has to show more than what you're actually paying yourself to continue to operate that business. Interesting side note. So, when we're talking in relationship to the way the profit exchange continues to happen, in relationship to all of that, we buy stuff that is being sold to us at a rate that we would never be able to meet if it was made here in the United States under the system that we currently have. And part of the reason why we've been able to do that for so long, 50 years since 1972, is the fact that we were the global reserve currency without, and this is the big thing, without any gold backing. We were operating on a popular concept currently referred to as modern monetary theory. Okay, this is entirely fiat currency. This allows us to go in and basically play with the money in any way we want. Okay, now there are several people who have looked at modern monetary theory and said, yes, we could have done this if we had stuck to the theory that was in place when we went to this idea. But I mean, to be honest, we trusted Congress, who failed to provide oversight in the Federal Reserve in the first place, which had overprinted the gold-backed currency. We trusted the Federal Reserve to continue to do that, past that. after we took away the requirement that it'd be a gold-backed currency. And we're currently in this situation right now where we have printed so much money over the last 2 years. And this is one thing, you cannot blame Biden for this. You can't really even blame Trump, because the oversight for the Federal Reserve isn't actually the President of the United States. Needless to say, both of those administrations have strongly encouraged the oversight committees to continue to allow the Federal Reserve and the appointees that are working on the Federal Reserve, which is a private company, by the way, to continue to print at will. So 8.5% inflation is what we're currently seeing on the back end. That's our purchasing power right now. One of the interesting side effects of that is currently production inflation. Okay, this is the cost to make the things we buy. Okay, the cost to make the things we buy is currently at 11.5%, a full 3% more. That is one of those things that's going to continue to affect us down the range as the cost of producing these goods that we buy continues to go up, because the industries aren't interested in losing that 90-day cycle profit margin that shows the company is viable. Jack Welch, responsible for the prioritization of profit for shareholders over the greater good of the company, employees, and consumers. Thank you, Jack Welch. This is the CEO only has the obligations to the profits of the shareholder. It absolutely destroyed all requirements for ethical management of US-based corporations that were being traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Okay, Congress is the problem. MMT describes how the currency operates. As long as we continue to allow the printing of the currency, we don't have a stable amount of currency, and that affects and devalues all of our savings and all of the current currency in play, because now there's so much more of it to purchase the same quantity of goods. More money, same quantity of goods. And unfortunately, they aren't giving this money to the people at the bottom. They will be buying it. They're actually playing games with it. And we're running into this problem, particularly with regards to housing. But that's a completely different issue. Let's go ahead and get back. I'm at about 19 minutes on this topic right now. One of the other issues is, of course, the globalized profit modeling. We just talked about that with regards to how our international corporations continue to operate on the international scale in order to make sure shareholders' profits continue to be maintained. Okay, international dependencies. Right? Absolutely, Elena. Reagan did a lot of damage. And this was part of the 80s. Because some of what Reagan did was build off of what Nixon did, honestly. And there's an extreme irony with regarding to Thatcherism and Reaganomics. One of the problems that we had when Thatcher and Reagan went and said, you know what, we need to deregulate the banks, we need to deregulate industry, we need to give them the freedom of movement, you know, in order to do the things in order to help the economy recover. Okay, they even pulled in several libertarian economists who were talking about the Austrian economy, you know, and even some of them that were talking about the Chicago School. Okay, Mosler, he's good on MMT. He's also libertarian minded. He's the one who's looking at how can we salvage the current system, the current monetary system that we have. He's got ideas. I'll give him that. He's got ideas. Whether or not we're even in a position where we can continue, where we can salvage enough of our financial situation to make his ideas work within the funding we have, remains to be seen, especially since Mosler isn't in charge right now. Libertarians aren't in charge right now. You got a bunch of Republicans and Democrats who love to tax and spend. They're the ones in charge right now. Unfortunately, they're realizing they've already hit the 30% tax bracket Those of you who are familiar with the Laffer curve, 30% is when bad things happen. 30% tax is when the tax cattle stop participating and drop out of the economy. They start looking at other options. They start looking at agorism, start looking at trading directly with their friends and neighbors for labor needed trades, goods, handcrafted materials, even home canned goods, rather than working through one of the 3 or 4 corporate owned food product processing facilities in the United States. Let's get back to this issue of international dependencies. Okay, international dependencies. Right now, we have done such a good job of maximizing the efficiency of certain industries around the world that there are literally only 2 or 3 places in the world where certain industries and certain products are created. We have simply made it impossible for the market to sustain in certain other areas. It's one of the reasons why when we look at tech, there's only about 2 or 3 countries that the global community buys tech from. Right? This is one thing. Mike, one of the things about this, 1980s, the 14.44%. Okay, now, one of the things about economics, particularly around 1980, 1970, is they had this concept. It was called the misery index. Okay. And how the misery index was done is it took the inflation rate. Okay. And if we're using the 1980 formula right now, 14.44%, it took the inflation rate and added it to the unemployment rate. Currently the United States explains that we have the lowest unemployment rate we've ever had. Okay. Keep in mind that that is the fact that we have restricted how long someone can stay on unemployment. So after about 8 or 16 weeks, everybody rolls off the unemployment rolls. So they're no longer counted as being unemployed, even though they still have no job and they're no longer contributing to the reporting of the economic system in the United States. So we were actually a step back and take a look. How has the workforce participation, how is it different now than it was 2 years ago at the start of COVID? And we're going to have to say that the workforce participation, you were to take the change in the workforce participation, okay, and correlate it to what should be the unemployment numbers. The misery index is actually at an all-time high. The number of people who are not working compared to the amount of inflation, we are simply falling behind too fast to be able to recover. And right now, the only thing that the United States government and the Treasury have been able to do in order to stave that off is print more money to give it away, which continues to increase the inflation rate. So it's one of those things. We were actually looking at a 1931 episode of neo-chartalism and what happens with hyperinflation when the economy proceeds to start collapsing. 14.44% if we're using the 1980 formula. Now, when we step back and we take a look at what's going on with this globalized profit model and the international dependencies, the fact that we have set up a situation where we can only get certain products from certain places in the world. We only get our technology. We only get computer systems out of Taiwan in order to put into our computers, or out of Fox Industries out of China. Okay, now we have this global supply chain that's breaking down because we don't have port workers. We can't move stuff out of California. Even if we got it into a warehouse in California, we don't have the people taking it out of the warehouses in California. So we're continuing to see this de-evolution of the global economy. Get your wheelbarrow. Yeah, Albertsons is pretty much an Idaho and Florida thing, folks. Got some stuff in Utah too, but Albertsons is the Idaho version of Kroger's. Yeah, Kroger's. There's an East Coast name. Yeah, the Piggly Wiggly. For those of you who are watching from the rest of the United States, this is one of those things. People getting ready to take the wheelbarrows, you know, and literally, we may actually need to be using our wheelbarrows before too much longer. Reason why is because gas is getting so flippin' expensive. Um, the extra money that DoorDash is currently paying their DoorDashers in order to go out and do that stuff. It's barely covering the extra cost of gas in order to continue doing the job. So the profit margin for home delivery services like Uber, for DoorDash, the delivery drivers are not making the profit margin they need on their driving in order to maintain sustainable operations in several communities around the United States. Even with compensation that's going in the fact that I honestly believe DoorDash, Uber Eats, and the rest of those home delivery services are currently being subsidized by the U.S. government in order to keep people at home. Some of the other things that we're looking at, the international corporations. Now, one of the things that's interesting right now is Idaho. One of our communities right here near the Treasure Valley, or in the Treasure Valley, outside of Boise, we're actually looking at putting in a Meta facility. Yes, Facebook is putting in a data center here in Idaho in order to diversify its location and spread out where it's currently set up, so that if one place actually suffers a catastrophic attack, brownout, the system still continues to operate. Okay, several of these corporations, AWS, Facebook, are continuing to set up these around the world in order to continue to maintain some sort of command and control. Yes, I use that word, command and control. Reason why is because so many of us actually continue to use these platforms for major communications. Okay, everything that happens on Facebook, the United States government knows about. Okay, are they able to do anything with it? Not really, simply because of the massive information that's being downloaded into it at any given time. They do not have enough spies sitting behind those cameras that are looking at me right now to be able to process all of that information in a timely manner. Yet they're still able to use that in order to track information flow, be able to track the primary concerns and considerations of the people you have regarding supply chain. Our reactions when Wall Street Journal says we are planning food shortages in the United States. Okay. They're not actually planned. They were forecast, and they knew it was happening. They're just finally in a position where they have to admit it. Those of us who were paying attention to the Chicago Commodities Exchange, what was going on in China with the relocation of the rural populations and the farmers in China to urban areas in order to work urban jobs, industry jobs, while they automated the farming. And understanding that their automation process is probably going to work as well as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Oh, come on, Mike. When you can't differentiate between the metadata center here in Idaho and the NSA data center in Utah. This is actually an interesting thing, because the amount of cooling, the amount of water that's associated with being able to run those and keep those data facilities cool so that they can process the data that is being managed in those in such a way and it's going to be expensive. And the fact that CUNA had to buy significant water rights in order to set up their facility out in CUNA, which makes me wonder who CUNA stole the water rights from in order to promise those water rights to Meta in order to in order to ensure that the Meta facility actually went in. I mean, if you take a look at the energy consumption for the 80, what is it, gigabytes or something, that's being handled down at the NSA data center down in Utah, yeah, this is going to be interesting, particularly with both of those so close to Mormon country. God's calling in from Salt Lake City, folks. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next issue. There has been a serious spike in crime in urban areas all across the United States. Now, you step back and take a look at what's going on with that. Whenever crime spikes in an area, you start seeing an exodus of the people who don't want to be involved in the crime, the people who don't want to be robbed, the people who don't want to be stolen from. And never mind the fact that many of those people who are in that position where they have something worth being stolen are already part of the well-to-do class. So literally, they're picking up and moving from an area where they set policy for the last 20 to 30 years, and they're moving to a new location. And in a lot of these places, because of the cost of living associated with New York, LA, these two areas in particular where you're seeing the boost in crime. And this is one of those things where you're actually looking at localized resurgence of organized crime. Okay, not as in the type of organized crime that targets corporations and businesses and money laundering. This is actually the point where we're looking at low-level organized crime, gang crimes. The subway shooting, we're going to talk about that in a different context, even though I have it right here, right now, because this is one of those things that's interesting, and it'll actually blend in here in a little bit. Okay. LA, one of the problems that LA has started running into is follow home burglaries. And literally, you have small gang like groups that are targeting individuals at work, following them home, and then robbing them once they get home. It's follow home robbery. They've had a rash of them. I think there's been about 5 reported in LA County so far this week. And this is a completely different change in tactic, completely different change in criminal behavior. Okay, and this is LA, this is Southern California, where they actually went through and they decriminalized petty theft. Okay. Think that through. Southern LA has decriminalized petty theft to the point where literally anybody who needs something can walk into any store, shoplift, and walk out, and they will not have to worry about criminal charges. You want a porterhouse steak? It's petty theft. Go in, pick up the steak, walk home, go home, fry it up, cook it. Even do it well done. God forbid. That is literally where it is at. Except right now, the situation has gotten so bad in LA, you are actually looking at them moving from petty theft to literal violent crimes against people in their homes for full-scale burglaries. We're continuing to see this deterioration across the United States in major metro areas. We don't see it so much in small little communities like Boise, Idaho, yet. We have had a little crime spike here, but not to the degree that LA and Chicago and New York are currently experiencing. This is one of those things. The Mass Transit Authority in New York recently experienced a subway shooting. Okay, this was violence in the subway. Somebody set off a smoke grenade, proceeded to shoot 33 rounds at the other members of the other passengers that were in the car, wounding 10 individuals, and then disappearing in the smoke. While the 3 cameras that were responsible for that particular car were disabled. Food riots and violent crimes. This is like in Brazil. It is within the realm of possibility. We are actually hoping the community leadership in several of these communities will actually step up and start doing leading rather than bossing. And unfortunately, this is one of those situations where some communities have that type of leadership and other communities do not. Okay, you take a look at what's happening in Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan, we've known about the water conditions in Flint, Michigan for nearly 5 years now. Probably even longer, 10 years. The fact that Flint, Michigan is a significant minority population that did not move when the auto industry left Detroit. Yes, and I'm actually going to talk about that here in a little bit, Brandy. So we understand that there are certain communities in the United States that have gotten into the habit that their leaders, when given resources to fight crime, stabilize housing, and give safe environments to the children and members of their community, will instead put the money in their pocket and proceed to buy mansions. And yes, there are several incidences in which that's occurred that are well documented, and we watched the corruption trials for several of these cities, mayors, whether they were elected mayors or whether they were appointed by the governor under emergency orders. Yes, we've continued to watch that. Flint, Michigan, back when Obama was president. This happened under Obama. They still don't have clean water. They're still drinking lead-tainted water. They were given the money at one time to fix that. Kids are still drinking lead chips. So communities. This goes back to what Mike was talking about here. I see food riots and violent crimes of opportunity becoming more normal. Okay. We've normalized desperation. The economic imbalances, the economic disparities between the haves and the have-nots as we slowly do away with the middle class. The middle class was what stabilized the United States. We had a middle class that had enough spare time that we could volunteer, that we could be community members, that we could help build and support our community, that we were there to help our neighbors. Whether you were looking at the red line districts in Black communities across the United States, they were still making enough to help their neighbors. Okay. What was going on in the suburbs after all of the white veterans coming back from World War II were given their nice little acre of land, in order to go out and be good little suburbanites for and nuclear families for the modern American model. We've completely crushed that. That culture in America is gone. And we've literally created this new situation where the haves and the have-nots, the disparity between the two levels, are likely, as Mike points out, to increase food riots and violent crimes of opportunity unless we do something drastic at the local level. And this is where I send out the pitch for dump the incumbents, because that's where it's at, folks. As long as we continue to exist under the current situation with the people that we have in governance, we will continue to have these problems because the people who are in the seats of power right now are committed to this path. They're committed to this direction. They are doubling down on their policies from 30 years ago that have brought us to this point. And unless you create a situation where we see significant change in Congress, in the state legislatures, we're going to continue to have this problem here in the United States. Okay. Right. It's the incumbent. It's incumbent on all of us to keep doing the right thing. And in building our community, we dump the incumbents. We really need to, because they're no longer looking out for the best interests of the people of the United States. They are focused almost entirely on maintaining their personal empires, their wealth, uh, hmm, which is disappearing rather quickly as the value of the dollar drops precipitously. Yes, I said precipitously. Okay, now, one of the other things I wanted to talk about was regards to the FBI. Okay, some of you are familiar, and as Brandy has mentioned, Frank James has been taken into custody. Okay, now this is less than 24 hours after the incident in question. Okay, now as this is related to the Mass Transit Authority, there's an awful lot of people who are stepping back and looking at this and going, why this? Why now? Why were the cameras off like they were in Jeffrey Epstein's cell? You know, why were the cameras not there, you know, for certain other incidences and shootings? Yona, dude, tornadoes. Yeah, the shelters, tornadoes out in Louisville and Lexington. Is it a little early for tornado season? Welcome to climate change, folks. Welcome to climate change. The desertification of the Pacific Northwest is creating long-term effects across the rest of the United States as the watersheds change and the water patterns are affected. Again, this comes back to policies from 1970 with regards to environmental and economics and ecology. That the people in power, the incumbents that have been there for 30, 40, 50 years, Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, he was a sitting senator in 1972. Okay. Step back and think that through. We have sitting legislators that have been in there for 50 years that are doubling down on the situation, both environmentally, economically, ecologically, politically, globally, that are continuing to cause our current situation to spiral out of control after what happened with the COVID situation. Now, one of the things that's interesting is we look back over this. Okay, the FBI. Currently dealing with a situation with the FBI because Frank James, who is the suspect associated with the Mass Transit Authority shooting in the subway in New York. Okay. In addition to the fact that the cameras were down, so there is no evidence of who actually pulled the trigger in that car. There was smoke in the facility, so the ability of eyewitnesses to identify the shooter in the car, especially as he shot 33 rounds in and only injured 10 people with 33 shots. You know, no deaths. And the only evidence that Frank James was even on the car at the time is his credit card was left on the floor of the car where the shooting occurred. Okay, now one of the things about justice here in the United States, and this is everywhere in the United States, some places are worse about it than others, is the need for instant satisfaction, for instant justice. Okay, there was a crime. There was a massively violent crime. We need the police to catch someone yesterday so that we can feel safe, because that will ensure to us that the perpetrator of this violence is off the streets. Okay. Yes. Awesome grift. Killing us softly. So what it is, this is instant justice. Okay. Frank James, under this current situation, looks like he has all the makings of a kangaroo court, specifically to massage the fears and the anxiety of the people of New York City. They want to know that the subways, the Mass Transit Authority, is safe again. You know, there's very little that actually ties Frank James to the shooting at this point. And for them to name him splash his name across the pages. Every implication of guilt without having gone through due process, without giving him the specific opportunity to present his side. Okay, now this is one of the situations. Frank James is actually a black supremacist. Okay, alleged black supremacist, from back a couple of years. Frank James is also a very elderly gentleman who may or may not be suffering cognitive issues associated with his age. Okay, less than 24 hours after this incident where allegedly he pulled a gun and shot 33 times into a crowded subway car. He was taken peacefully in the east side of New York. East Village, I believe it was. Okay. During his time as a very vocal black supremacist in New York City, he became very well known by the FBI. In 2019, Frank James was cleared by the FBI as a domestic terror threat. The FBI literally said, nah, James is a good guy. Okay. He's just a little vocal. The FBI said, don't worry about James. And now James has been taken into custody for a terrorist action on the Mass Transit Authority in New York City with very little evidence. During a time when an awful lot of people in New York City were panicking about the thought of being able to use the Mass Transit Authority to use the subway safely. Okay, for those of you who believe in justice, this is a case that really needs to be followed closely. Because this can easily turn into one of those situations, the justice of the moment, in order to lighten the anxiety of the people of New York City. May very well turn into a situation where an innocent man is put behind bars. So pay attention to the case for those of you who are paying, for those of you in particular. Meanwhile, this also comes shortly after several members that were enticed by the Federal Bureau of Investigations to participate in a conspiracy to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer were acquitted for entrapment. Right. At this point, we've seen too much of it. Right now, all across the United States, the Innocence Project is continually exonerating people who've been in prison for 20, 30, 40 years. We've actually had cases where, DAs, prosecuting attorneys, have come forward to work with the Innocence Project in saying, yeah, I did some bad things to people, and I want to see them exonerated. We got an awful lot of people who are currently working as prosecutors across the United States that are doing bad things to people. These are things we need to watch out. These are things we need to be careful of with regards to justice, with regards to the pressure to find the criminals responsible for certain extreme violent behaviors. Are we giving them a fair trial? Are we giving them due process? Are we treating them fairly in the media in relationship to what is going on? This is one of those things. Yep, Brandy, you used the word suspect. Okay. The evidence is lacking. But this is literally a situation where the mass media all of the media, has already declared Frank James guilty of the mass shooting, despite all of the lack of this evidence. We need to do better at justice, folks, all across. Fordham report, 138 domestic terrorism incidences between 2001 and 2012 involved FBI informants instigating, recruiting, supplying, and planning. Can't have a conspiracy to a revolution without the FBI being found on site. And think about it. And this situation continues. Yeah, and we don't hold bad cops accountable either. Cops who plant evidence, cops who abuse their authority, cops who lie about testimonies, about what they heard people say, in interview rooms, in interviews. We do not hold those cops accountable. We haven't. Qualified immunity continues to allow them to walk. Public unions, like the police unions, continue to allow them to walk or be reassigned, so that they can continue to do all the bad things that they do, rather than actually being put back out in the public without that authority that allows them to continue to intimidate, bully, and prosecute innocent people all across the United States. And yeah, we punish good cops. Cops, whistleblower cops. Okay? We actually have law enforcement organizations in the United States that have prosecuted and persecuted good cops for blowing the whistle on bad cops, to the point those good cops ended up in prison. And qualified immunity. It's one of the biggest principles that should be part of, the next 10 years of politics in the United States, an end to qualified immunity. Yet that's not where we're going. There's almost no political establishment in the United States anywhere that has actually made moves to end qualified immunity. How do you fix a broken law enforcement system if you don't repair the one thing that allows it to be broke? So when you're looking at your incumbents, when you're looking at the people who are replacing them, what are their views on those issues? What are they interested in decriminalizing so that the good cops have less work? What are they doing about qualified immunity so that bad cops actually get fired and stay fired for breaking the law in the process of enforcing the law? Okay. These are things you need to think about as we move forward with, into the election season. Now, primaries all across the United States are going to be happening soon. Idaho's primaries are actually happening in May. Yes, Idaho's primaries are happening in May. Other states have a little bit more time. Right now, we are looking at a real interesting situation as Idahoans are trying to decide whether they want to keep the establishment politicians, whether they want to go with the populist politicians, or whether or not they actually want freedom from politics. Mike, yes, qualified immunity, civil asset forfeiture, no-knock warrants, the FISA warrants. If you were dictator. Mike's one of those people who's like me, I want to take over the world so I can leave you alone. These things that allow the authoritarians to continue to exercise authority in bad ways need to go away. Okay. qualified immunity, civil asset forfeiture, no-knock warrants, FISA warrants. Okay, these are all things that need to go away so that the authoritarians can stop using these systems to abuse the people. Yeah, absolutely. Breonna Taylor's murderers are still free. Amir Locke's murderers, not even being charged. We continue to see this problem all across the United States. We are literally at the situation where civil asset forfeiture takes more money from U.S. citizens than burglary does. Okay, think that through. Cops steal more than burglars do. We also run into a situation where within certain communities, cops kill more than anybody else. Okay. With that, I got to roll, guys. It's been great having this conversation. Looking forward to seeing you guys again next week. Hopefully, we'll be able to find something a little bit more cheerful to talk about. Because Lord knows I'm getting a little bit tired of talking about all of this stuff. It's just ugly. Go out, find something beautiful in your world to enjoy today. Go out and find something beautiful to enjoy this weekend. Know that there is hope. Know that there is community. Know that there are people who want to be part of your community and who want to see you lifted up. Not everybody's in it for themselves, folks. Find the good in yourself, find the good in other people. In time. Family, friends, community. As long as you got those three, you can make anything happen. See you next week.